Hey, Ray, it's David J. Murphy, host of Around the Lens. Happy to have another interview here with a filmmaker, this time the writer, producer, and director of the film The Goose That Laid the Golden Egg, Mr. Doug Bremner. Doug, welcome to the program.
Well, thanks for having me.
Happy to have you here. Talk to me about the story behind this film and how it came to be.
Well, I'm a medical doctor and a medical researcher, so I have experience as an expert witness in drug safety litigation. So it's a fictionalized story, but it is based on my real life experience with drug safety and specifically, with an acne medication that was linked to depression and suicide.
Yeah, so you kind of saw this. Obviously, it's based on a true story. It's kind of the big selling point of the film, I think. And you had firsthand experience with this whole case. And so you wanted to create a fictionalized narrative around that to essentially kind of get the word out, basically, right?
Yeah, well, I think that something that people are not exposed to is this sort of behind the scenes story that goes on behind what I call the academic pharmaceutical um, industrial complex, if you will. Both you have the university, you have the pharmaceutical manufacturers of drugs, and then you have the regulatory bodies, like the FDA, and each has their own agenda. And when you have a drug that's making $1 billion a year, it really raises the stakes. And so that's a ripe forum for conflict. And as someone who's been a screenwriter and interested in filmmaking, and in fact, that I wrote this screenplay originally because a friend of mine who also writes screenplays and is also a doctor, when I was telling him about my experience in Expert Witness, he said that would make a great movie. And if you look at it, it really is true because you've got these dual opposing forces that are sort of crashing together, and each has its own agenda, and each is convinced of the nobleness of their cause, if you will. So that's the story behind it. But most of the films that you see in the legal arena is more told from the standpoint of the lawyers or of maybe the people that are involved, but you never really see that behind the scenes look at what it's like to be a medical expert or a expert witness. And if you look at all the litigation related to Dow Chemical or product safety, or a number of different things, that's always really at the center of this conflict.
Right, absolutely. And you mentioned obviously your experience as a screenwriter. What kind of other experience did you have in the world of directing that helped you direct this film?
Well, this is my second film. The first film, of course, is the very difficult experience in many ways because you don't have the confidence to always insist on things um, that are needed for the movie. And so what I learned from my first film is that if you have a hunch about something that's not going well or something's not right, um, and even if everyone is pushing against you, you really have to put your foot down and insist. Um, and even if it means um, not being on the good side of people sometimes, or violating the budget or the schedule. Everyone has their own agenda. The location manager wants to get to the next location on time as scheduled. People want to stay within the boundaries of the union rules and the budget, et cetera. But I learned that it's important to really insist on something. And in this case, for instance, we were being pushed to use a studio for one of the court scenes, and we had both the primary trial, but then we had an appeal, so we needed two different courtrooms, and we got locked out of one of our original locations, a courtroom in Noonan, Georgia, and at the last minute, so I had to scramble to find alternatives, and one of them was like an hour away, and people were saying, "No, that's too far away, and it's not going to work." And it was in the middle of the city, and the logistics were too difficult. And both myself and the cinematographer felt strongly that we really needed that location to have a real look, courthouse. And so, we kind of did that like literally on the last day. We sort of winged it and it pulled through, and it worked out well.
Well, that's great to hear. Yeah, I mean, I did my own feature film, and literally we were trying to scramble to get locations at the very last minute. I remember one of the locations we didn't get till the morning of. I had to go down to meet with the location manager, who owned the location, and give them insurance documents and get everything signed. And so, and we were shooting later that day, so I was like, I don't know. So that was a pretty harrowing event, but we got through it and we made the film. And I'm glad that you were able to get through it and make this film. Talk to me about what went into the filmmaking process. I'd like to always geek out on nerdy stuff like cameras and lenses and other sort of technical details. So, kind of what went into the decision making there?
Well, the cinematographer was someone I'm friends with. His name is Jim McKinney. He was cinematographer on our first film, which is called Inheritance Italian Style, and I connected with him because my son was friends with a brother of his son, and uh, so he's the he kind of does all we shoot in 4K and digital, etc. And he and I have a good working relationship, and when he's shooting, he's really kind of absorbed in what he's doing, and my big thing was trying to drag him to places before, because he kind of had he had the approach like he can figure it out, like that's his favorite phrase, we'll figure it out. And my saying was always like, let's get there first, and then get the mind rolling about what it is that what are the challenges that we're going to need, or what are the shots that we're going to actually film. So, and he's busy. He also teaches at Trilla Studios, which is here in Georgia. So he's in demand, and you know how it is, like when you're working with freelancers, they're whatever job they comes up, that's what they're on, right? And so
Right.
they're not going to schedule things far out in advance. So that was the big challenge, is sort of getting him on there. And then I had, I did you know look toured location, so I'm sort of touring locations with people as they're available. I had some people where I would tour just with them, like pretty much all the locations, and then they dropped out because the Tyler Perry film came along, right?
Oh,
So
wow.
you
So
know
you
that
filmed
kind of
this
thing.
in Atlanta?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
That's great.
So yeah, so Georgia's had, like, there's Tyler Perry Studios, and then there's a lot of the Marvel comic movies were shot here, and The Walking Dead, and
Right.
um, Ozark, was shot here. But now, sort of like California, a lot of the studios are moving to Europe.
Yeah.
So the same thing is happening here. But
I know Disney just pulled out of Atlanta, I believe,
y-
for all their Marvel stuff and everything, right?
right, and that was a big employer, so
Yeah.
it's challenging. So, but the good news for someone like me is that the people that were working on those, with those big studios, are now available, and so we took
Right.
advantage of that.
Oh, okay.
So we probably had better crew than I would have anticipated.
Yeah. No,
Um,
that's great. So their
Previously.
loss is your gain in a
Yeah, so
sense.
they were available. Mhm.
Did you consider other locations outside of Atlanta, or was Atlanta always going to be the location you want to shoot in?
Well, I live in Atlanta, and we have the Georgia film tax credit at 30% for whatever you spend in Georgia. Um, and the story was based in Atlanta. A lot of the meetings at the airport hotels with the lawyers and stuff, that all sort of happened here. And so in my mind, a lot of the drama happened here, or was at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, which no longer exists, was in the Buckhead neighborhood of Atlanta. So a lot of the scenes in my mind were located here. So the city sort of became, I would call, like another character in the story. So we have my brother, Steve Bremner, did the drone footage, which I think everyone really liked. And we had a lot of shots of the city, and of the Beltline. It's a popular place where people can ride bikes and walk, and then the Chattahoochee River. The original screenplay had a lot more about rivers and stuff in the and the symbolism and everything. And in the end, all of that got cut out pretty much. So we ended up just with one drone shot of a river, but it was, it worked out well. Another reason why a lot of that got cut was when you getting back to logistics, I had these scenes in my mind on the Chattahoochee River, but then when it came down to it, it's like, well, we can't have like a whole crew and a bunch of actresses in their high heels walk half an hour down the path to the Chattahoochee River, and it'll be a violation of the union rules, et cetera, et cetera. So we dropped that, but I don't think it hurt the movie. Whenever when you can compress and things don't get worse, then that's always a good thing, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Obviously, for a film to be eligible for the tax credit, it has to have a budget of at least 500,000, I believe, in at least the city or Atlanta. Can you talk to me about how this film was funded? Was it self-funded, or did you have investors? And how was the process toward getting it funded? Was it relatively easy, or was it a long, drawn-out process?
Well, I had some, like a lot of things, there's sort of a start-stop process.
Sure.
So we had to start about 6 years ago, and I had some investors, and we were shooting for a larger budget. We had several actors from Los Angeles um, who, were fairly well known from TV shows, etc.
Sure.
Um, and I sort of had this idea, like, if you make it, they will come, right? Well, it doesn't really work out that way in real life. So we actually did all the pre-production, and we had some, um, some rented some space down at the Screen Gems, it's called. It's sort of like it's old Cotton Expo. It's sort of it's like a lot, like a studio lot, if you
Right.
will, in Atlanta. Um, and But we came right up to it, and the cinematographer said, if you keep going, you're going to spend $1 million in the next week. So I said, okay,
Mhm.
well, we don't have $1 million, so we put a hold on it there. But we had enough investment that to sort of do all the pre-planning and do the casting, a lot of the casting, and kind of work a lot of things out. And then when we restarted again, um, we had some you, some more investment, most of it mine. And we did have a budget that was over 500,000 in the end.
Right.
And we had the film tax credit, and then there's a personal tax credit as well, the section 158, I think it's called, where money you put into a film, you can deduct on your personal taxes, so that helped.
Right.
And so it was like personal funding, and then loans, um some loans, and yeah, and hopefully get some of that back.
I know, right? That's the hope, right? Yeah, someone who personally funded their own feature film, like that's something I'm, desperate for once it's actually out there in the world, which will hopefully be this summer, but we'll see about that.
Mhm.
Uh, what is sort of your plans for future films after this is done? Do you have any other films in the sort of hopper, whether it be in a sort of screenplay form, and do you plan to tackle more of this similar subject, which is, litigation and kind of real world type events?
Well, I read somewhere that to be a good screenwriter, you need to write 11 screenplays. So I set that as a goal.
11?
11, yep, that's
Oh,
the magic
okay.
number.
Cool.
And so I've written 11, and in terms of like future filmmaking, we'll have to at least make back what we put into this film
Of
first.
course.
I'm married. If it were up to me, I would probably spend all my money on this because it's a lot of fun.
Of course.
um, but the other screenplay that I have, probably most at the top of my mind, is called Murder Without Death. It's based on a book written by, again, another doctor from Georgia, who this time uh, exposed some health hazards in a workplace at a manufacturing plant, and then was framed by the CEO and put in jail.
Mm,
That's like someone that I know personally. He's passed away now, but that has a lot of drama, and it's another kind of doctor story, which obviously I can relate to. Um, but he was in jail and was dispensing medical advice, to his patients through the jail bars. And same guy who got me started writing screenplays is Neil Schulman. He wrote Doc Hollywood with Michael J. Fox. He was moonlighting at that particular town outside of Atlanta, and he walks by the jail and he says, "Hey Jack, you should write a book about this." So he did write the book. It's a pretty interesting book. But he was that was in Carroll County, Georgia, which at the time was very corrupt. And he told me one time, if you got the cops and you've got the judges and you've got the county administration, then you got it all locked up. And that's pretty much the way it was there at that time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You've got some, notable folks within your film: Carolyn Avery Granger, Crystal Watson, and whatnot, as well as Nissy Woods. Talk to me about what went into choosing those particular actors for your film, and what you saw in them that helped them convey the content.
Well, so Carolyn was in our first film, and so I, of course, knew her well, and we knew that she would be solid, that we would get, she would deliver, right? So that was sort of one of the things you worry about is like taking chances, and like if an actor doesn't perform, it really takes you out of the story, right? And it can be a real disaster. So we knew that we were solid with her. Some of the other actors that had been cast in our 5 years ago, so like Sean Sharma had been cast by a casting director that we had at the time. Um, and he was real solid. Um, some of the other people, David DeVries, who played Red Leghorn, the lawyer from Texas, he was someone who does a lot of audiobooks, and he had, both my wife and I are professors, and he had done an audiobook for some material that my wife had written. And so she knew him well, and really, kind of strongly advocated for him. Some of the others were, we're trying to get local, talent to save on the expense of travel. And for both Nisi and for Andy Evans, I just looked at like hundreds of demo reels on backstage.com, and then, asked them to do a videotape, you know, recital. Um, and Nisi she played the evil Renzon lawyer, and she kind of absorbed that character immediately. And one of the only mistakes I made was like when I first saw her reading the character, I said, "Why don't you dial it down 5%?" And that kind of threw her off. And so then I said, after I said, just stop listening to anything I say, just do your thing.
Right.
You'll be fine. That's is perfect. No need for me to give unnecessary feedback. Hannah Fearman is someone that we had a producer in the 5 years ago phase who kind of dropped out on the current phase, who was friends with her because she's from Atlanta and she knows a lot of people that have been in the local. She does a lot of horror films. So her comment was, "This is completely different than anything I've ever done before."
Hmm.
She
Yeah,
was,
no, it,
yeah.
it it very much feels like kind of almost a procedural, because you have a lot of scenes in courtrooms and just, people in rooms having conversations, which is, most of the time what a drama is. Uh, I wonder, were there any sort of specific challenges that came in the filmmaking besides the one you already mentioned about, having to find a new location and, not walking people too far?
Well, I mean, getting these courthouses is a big deal. We've got these, there's a lot of counties, within an hour or so of Atlanta they have these historic courthouses that are usually right on the town square. And oftentimes they've built a new courthouse, and so they're no longer using the historic courthouse. So we were able to get those. And many of them, the architecture is very, very beautiful. Um, I had a challenge in terms of the medical scenes, in that, my employer did not want us to film there.
Hmm.
So, and they're like the largest sort of medical complex in Georgia, really, in
Hmm.
terms of um, owning multiple hospitals, et cetera. So we really didn't have a medical location. So we were sort of toying with the idea of, showing people in the scanner and stuff like that. But in the end, we didn't really need that. And I was able to fill that I have a friend who has a company that recycles toxic materials. And so they have sort of a
Wow.
lab type setup, and it looks kind of medical, and we were able to fake it just enough that I think it came across, pretty well. And it had that sort of semi-industrial look that you get a lot of times in kind of more aging medical facilities, I guess you would say.
Right.
Where so we had like scenes where they're, in the camera, and then they're kind of doing the lab type stuff, and meeting with the research subjects and that sort of thing. So that was a big worry for me, but it in the end it came out well, in my
Yeah.
opinion.
Right. No, absolutely. What did you shoot on?
It was with it's like a Panasonic uh, camera, digital.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was looking at some photographs from the behind the scenes, and so I was like, "What kind of camera is that?" I always love talking about cameras and whatnot, geeking out over the nerdy stuff. What kind of is sort of the call to action or lasting sort of impression that you hope this film leaves with people who get the chance to watch it?
Well, I hope it raises some awareness about what goes on behind the scenes. And I kind of started out, um, well, going back to when I was, first started working as expert witness. It was sort of an eye-opening experience for me. And so after that, I wrote this book called "Before You Take That Pill: Why the Drug Industry May Be Bad for Your Health." And
Hmm.
part of it was sort of out of anger, being deposed so many times, but part of it was sort of an advocacy on the basis of the healthcare consumer, if you will. So, like I mentioned, my friend Neil Schulman, who's also friends with Patch Adams, who is also an executive producer on this film. And there's a film made about him starring Robin Williams. And he's sort of, both of them are sort of advocates for patients, and for, kind of, not, kind of advocating for not being the victim of pharmaceutical greed, if you will, I guess you could say, and not necessarily just accepting things the way, that the way they're presented to you, but sort of trying to take hold of your own health and your own, treatment, and what medications you're taking, et cetera. And in the film, the mother, who was, you don't really, it doesn't come out in the story, but her backstory was that she had worked as a nurse, and some of the scenes that we cut were her showing that she was somewhat gullible to the medical system and sort of accepted things and didn't necessarily question the way they were. You sort of see that though more in the fact that she is telling her son to take this medication for acne, and then it ends up, causing him to commit suicide. So then she goes on this arc where she's takes more control over her life, and in the end, she's sort of the one that figures out the legal twists that make it possible for them to appeal. This whole thing about the Fry standard, legal standard, et cetera. And you see that she's sort of reading the law books herself and not passively, waiting for people to tell her what to do. So in the same way, it'd be like, hopefully the message would be, to take charge of your own health and educate yourself, and not just sort of passively accept, um, whatever comes your way in terms of the healthcare world. If that makes any sense. I think you're
Sorry about that. Okay, let me jump in. 5, 4, 3, 2. Well, we're nearing our time together. Excuse me, let me try that again. 5, 4, 3, 2. Well, we're nearing the end of our time together. Before we say goodbye, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I appreciate the chance to, to come on your show, and the the showing of our film will be June 27th at the TCL Chinese Theaters in Hollywood,
Awesome.
at 3:45 p.m. So you can get the tickets for the film if you're in LA at danceswithfilms.com.
That's great. And where can people go to find more about the film itself?
Um, the film is our website is goosefilm.io, but goosefilm.com also directs there.
Hmm.
And our other websites are laughingcatproductions.com is the name of my company, and then
Right.
my website is dougbremner.com.
Is there a story behind the name Laughing Cow Productions, or is that just something funny?
That it was just sort of a name that came to me, but then I later realized that these are these little cheeses I ate when I was in, second grade.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
right. Of
yeah,
course.
they would give you those little. So it's just enough to be in the back of your mind that you ate those little cheeses, but you don't see Laughing Cow cheese around enough that it would really ring a bell. But anyway, once I went with that, then it was just sort of, no reason to go back.
There you go. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for being on the program, Doug. We really appreciate it and wish the film all the luck and hope you are able to recoup those costs. I know that's obviously the goal of most of us as filmmakers. So I wish you all the best on your journey toward that and many future films, of course, in your future. Now you've gotten past that 11th screenplay, time for the 12th, 13th, 14th, and so on. Awesome.
Right. All right. Thanks,
Thank you
Dave.
again, Doug. Have a great weekend, and I'll talk to you later.
Okay. Thank you.